I gotta admit, I'm kind of liking doing this in my shades. So the last thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give it its own video because I know people are always really interested in this topic, and I have a lot of knowledge about it because I wrote a dissertation on it, and that is interracial or interethnic marriage. Um, Interracial marriage, particularly between blacks and whites, was illegal in 41 states in the United States of America at one point or another. And it wasn't until the year 1967 in a famous Supreme Court case called, ironically, Loving versus Virginia, where a couple sued the state of Virginia. They had gotten married in Washington, D.C. They traveled back to Virginia. Virginia threatened to arrest them for a white man marrying a black woman. It was legal in D.C., but it was not legal in Virginia, and they were threatened with up to 20 years in jail just for marrying each other. But the Loving versus Virginia decision overturned those laws. Those laws were called anti-miscegenation laws. Those are laws that forbade interracial marriage. And so what has happened in the U.S. is from that point on, very, very slowly, it has not been a quick process, the number of people intermarrying has increased. If we look at all marriages in the U.S., and we do not count Latinos as a race, about 5% of marriages are interracial. If we count Latinos as a race, and the census does not count Latinos as a race, you can be Latina and look like me, you could be Latina and look like Oprah, you could be somewhere in the middle of all that and look like J-Lo or something. Approximately 90 to 91% of marriages are people of the same race marrying each other. So again, when we add Latinos, the number of intermarriages actually goes up. So from about 5%, and if we count Latinos, it goes up to about 8 to 10% of all marriages. But that's counting all marriages. That's counting people who got married 40 years ago, 50 years ago. If we only look over the past few years, right, the percent of intermarriages is actually quite a bit higher. So if you look at the past 3 or 4 years, it's around 15 to 17% of all recent marriages involve people who are from different racial or ethnic backgrounds. The most common combination, again, if you count Latinos as a race, is whites and Latinos. The next most common is Asians and whites, and African Americans and whites, and Native Americans and whites are next. And then the smallest group is the various groups of color marrying each other. So for example, Black Asian or Asian Latino. But again, that's a huge change. Another issue that comes up with intermarriage is approval. And that could be general societal approval, social approval, and family approval. And what we find is while many people say they think intermarriage should be legal, there are still a small percentage of people, about 10%, who believe that it should not be legal. So you can imagine that's actually, a pretty strong level of disapproval. The greater group of people who are disapproving of intermarriage are people who sort of have the mentality that it should be legal, but I don't want my kid to do it. I think it causes problems. I think your children will have problems. That sort of mentality is still pretty common in our culture. And while some people are accepting, they're not generally celebratory of it. They're not always as supporting as they might be if their child married someone of the same background or if their friend married someone of the same background. So social approval and family approval are still very big issues. One of the factors that affects approval is race. When we look at just survey questions, it looks like there aren't huge differences. But when we conduct interviews, what you start to find is that whites are the group that are the least approving of intermarriage. For family approval, parents of women are less likely to want them to intermarry and less likely to approve of intermarriage than parents of sons. A lot of times they cite things like fears about the children or stereotypes about the group that their child's partner is in. So they might think like, black people are bad with money, or Asian people are too insular, or I don't know, whatever stereotypes they may have. There are some gender discrepancies in who gets married. The white Latino marriage pattern and the white Native American marriage pattern is pretty even. But when you break it down for African American white marriages, the majority of those marriages, the last data I saw was about 69%, 65% are white women and black men. And Asian white marriages follow a somewhat similar pattern. Those are like about 65% white men and Asian women. So it's interesting that there's a gender variation in the rates of intermarriage. And we could talk a lot about why that might be. Might the way racism is enacted be gendered? Could the family approval factor play into that? All of those things are entirely possible.